The morning of the sale, there were 21 cows nobody wanted. They stood crowded into the last pen at the far end of the Milner County stockyard, the pen the auctioneer called end of line, and the men leaning on the rail called something less polite. These were the cattle that hadn't sold anywhere else, pulled off a repossessed ranch 2 counties west, animals that had spent the driest summer in a decade picking at scorched range, with no one checking on them but the bank's hired hand. They were thin in the way that made grown men look somewhere else. Hip bones pressed up under dull, patchy hide. Ribs you could count from 30 feet. One heifer stood with her head low against the rail, like holding it up was a bill she couldn't cover anymore. Into that pen, on a gray Thursday in September, walked a woman not yet 30, a bidding paddle in one hand, and nothing on her face that gave anything away. Her name was Wren Calloway, and she had been back in Milner County for exactly 19 days. She stood at the rail and looked at those 21 animals for a long time, long enough that the men beside her stopped talking and started watching her instead. Then she lifted her paddle and bought the entire lot for less than the going rate of 2 good steers. Someone laughed. It was Dutch Marrow, who ran the largest cow-calf operation in the county and had never once in his life let a silence sit unfilled. He said, loud enough to carry across the whole barn, that the girl had just bought 21 bags of bones and a winter's worth of buzzard bait, and that her grandmother's worn-out ground wouldn't keep a jackrabbit alive, let alone a herd. He said the whole thing would be over before the first snow. He meant it as a joke at her expense. It would turn out to be the first line of a story he'd spend the rest of his life telling differently. If you're the kind of person who's drawn to these stories, the slow ones, where the person everyone counted out turns out to be holding the one card nobody else could see, do me a favor before we go further. Tap that like button so this reaches the people who need it. And drop a comment with the name of the town you're watching from. I read every one, and I like knowing how far these stories travel. Wren Calloway had not come home to Milner County with a plan. She'd come home because her grandmother, Opal Calloway, had died in July, and there had been no one else left to see to the place, and because the life Wren had been building 400 miles away, in a city she rarely mentioned by name, had ended quietly, the way a rope frays before it finally gives. She arrived with an unfinished agriculture degree she'd never put to use, a Bronco with a check engine light she'd learned to ignore, and one duffel bag that fit on the passenger seat. The land she inherited sat at the dead end of a caliche road, tucked into a fold of red hills, 360 acres, most of it rough pasture and cedar-choked draws, with maybe 60 acres of anything you'd call good bottom ground. The house stood square and stubborn against the wind. The barn leaned east, same as every barn in that country, all of them bowing slowly to the same prevailing gusts. Opal had run cattle on that ground for over 50 years. Never many, never fat, but always something. And she'd carried the place through droughts and blizzards and cattle markets that rose and fell like the county's own moods. The neighbors had regarded her the way you regard a fence post that should have rotted out years ago, but somehow never does. Wren remembered summers here as a girl, trailing behind her grandmother through the pastures, while the old woman said almost nothing and pointed at things with a lift of her chin. Wren hadn't thought about any of it in years, but standing in the empty kitchen the week after the funeral, looking out at fences that needed mending and pasture gone rank with 2 years of her grandmother's failing health, something in her settled instead of scattered. She wasn't going to sell. She didn't fully know why yet. She only knew that where everyone else saw a burden, She felt the particular quiet of a place waiting to be understood. Before she bought a single animal, before she fixed a single strand of wire, Wren went looking through the small office off the kitchen, her grandfather Hollis's room, a man who died before she was born. Inside an old roll-top desk, buried under tax stubs and seed receipts, she found them. 24 small, cloth-bound ledgers, spanning nearly 40 years. Hollis had written in a tight, upright hand, daily weather, condition of the grass, which pasture the herd moved to and why, and long stretches of observation that read less like farm bookkeeping and more like the notes of a man, in quiet love, with a question he never stopped chasing. One phrase recurred, underlined in the margins of a dozen different entries, always beside notes about which fields held up best in dry years. The land keeps score. It just waits longer than we do. Near the back of the final notebook, dated the spring before he died, one line stood apart, boxed off from everything around it. The gaunt ones off the burned country are worth 10 of the fat ones off easy grass. If you know how to read what they're telling you. Tell Opal. Opal was gone now too. But the line stayed with Wren, and she copied it into the front page of a brand new notebook of her own, because without quite deciding to, she'd started keeping one. There was one person left who might explain it. Ida Faubus, Opal's older sister, 89 years old, living alone in a small house at the edge of town. In her day, people said Ida had understood cattle even better than Opal did, before she gave it up decades earlier when her husband died. Ida wasn't an easy woman to draw out. She wore men's canvas coats because they lasted, and she said maybe a tenth of what she was actually thinking. Wren brought the notebook to her kitchen table, opened it to the boxed line, and asked what it meant. Ida looked at the page a long while. Then she said that her brother-in-law had spent his whole life trying to prove something nobody in this county wanted to hear, that an animal which stayed alive on bad ground was telling you the truth about herself, and that the truth was worth more than fat. Fat, she said, you could buy with a feed truck and a line of credit. What you couldn't buy was an animal whose body had already sorted itself out, one that could turn poor grass into flesh and didn't fall apart the first hard year. Those are the ones, Ida said. Then she told Wren that Hollis had built the foundation of his entire herd out of the discount pens, the culls, the leftovers, the too thin, because that ground had already done the sorting for him. If Wren was thinking what Ida suspected she was thinking, she should go to the sale, stand at the rail, and watch, not for the fattest of the poor lot, for the ones who stood square in the middle of the pen, instead of pressed into the corners. Those are the ones, Ida said again. That was the whole of the advice. It was enough. Wren stood at that rail in the Milner County stockyard and did exactly what her great-aunt told her, watching not the heaviest of the thin cattle, but the ones who held themselves upright, who watched her back with clear, steady eyes, instead of dull ones, who stood in the open instead of hiding in the corner. There were 21 of those. She bought all 21, while Dutch Marrow laughed and called them buzzard bait. She didn't argue. She'd learned, in a city and in a childhood both, that arguing with a man like Dutch was like arguing with weather. She only told him, flat and without heat, that she'd let him know how it went. She hauled her 21 Bony cows home in 2 trips on a borrowed trailer and turned them out into pasture that stood belly-high in rank, ungrazed grass her grandmother had let go the last 2 years of her life. The cattle put their heads down and started eating. Wren stood at the fence in the last light and wrote her first entry in the new notebook. The date, 21 head. She didn't name them. Ida had told her once, on a different afternoon, that you don't name what you might have to sell. She almost held that line, but there was one. A rust-colored cow with a crooked blaze down her face, the first to walk toward Wren at the rail, and the last to look away. That Wren was calling the Duchess in her own head within a week, and had written into the notebook by the end of the month. The work that first fall was slow, unglamorous, and mostly invisible to anyone who wasn't paying attention, which meant it was invisible to almost the entire county. Wren walked the fence lines herself, splicing wire and setting posts by hand, working the pastures in the order Hollis's notebook suggested, starting with the fields he'd marked as the first to green up after a dry spell. Because that, he reasoned, was where the good grass wanted to grow if you'd only let it. She didn't overgraze. This was the first thing she got right, and the thing that would matter most, though she couldn't have known it yet. She rotated the herd field to field on a schedule built from Hollis's records, always pulling cattle off while there was still green standing, never grazing a pasture to the dirt. The rested ground came back thicker, deeper rooted, than anyone in the county believed that soil could grow. By October, the 21 gaunt cattle off the burned range had begun, slowly, to change. Coats came in glossy. Hip bones softened under new flesh, laid on nothing but grass, rest, and clean water. The Duchess grew broad and confident and started leading the others to the gate at feeding time. The men at the feed store noticed first Milner Farm and Ranch Supply, where Wren went every couple of weeks, and where the same handful of established cattlemen gathered to trade prices, weather, and gossip like currency. They noticed her because she was new, young, and a woman running the ruin of a place and everyone had already written off. They noticed her because Dutch Marrow had turned the sale day story into county folklore, embellishing it a little more with every telling. When Wren came in, the talk would go quiet. Then someone, usually a heavy-set man named Grover Pate, who ran cattle in the bottoms and considered himself Dutch's second in all matters of opinion, would ask her, with false friendliness, how her buzzards were doing. The others would grin. Wren bought what she needed and answered plainly and never rose to it. Once, when Grover asked if she'd buried any of them yet, she said, "Not yet," in a tone so level it took the fun clean out of the question. The store owner, an old-timer named Silas Whitlock, who'd known 3 generations of Callaways, watched these exchanges without comment. But he caught Wren once on her way out and said almost to himself that her grandfather used to buy that exact kind of stock too, and that people had laughed at him as well. Wren wrote it in her notebook that night. It was the first time anyone in the county had said her grandfather's name to her like it meant something more than a debt long since paid. The winter. That first winter came down hard, the way it did every 3rd or 4th year in that country. A stretch of January days that never cleared single digits, wind off the caprock like it had somewhere to be. This was the season that killed thin cattle, and the county waited to watch it kill wrens. Dutch said as much to anyone who'd listen, that the girl's whole experiment would be settled by the spring thaw, and there'd be 21 carcasses to prove it. But Wren had read the notebooks, and the notebooks were full of winters. Hollis had written again and again that cattle raised and bred on hard ground wintered easiest because their bodies had never learned to depend on ease. Wren wintered her herd the old careful way. Feeding hay she'd put up herself from rested fields, sheltering them in the draws out of the wind, walking out every morning through snow to break ice on the trough and count heads. All 21 came through. Every one, coats thick, eyes clear. When the March thaw finally broke and the low pasture began to green, Wren turned the herd out, and they walked into spring sound and whole, and 6 of them visibly, undeniably bred from a borrowed bull she'd run with them in the fall, on the strength of a single line in Hollis's notebook about not waiting for an animal to prove herself before you gave her the chance to. The county didn't know that yet. It would. By May, there were calves. 11 in the end, more than the 6 Wren had counted on, because 5 more cows she hadn't expected to breed had taken as well. They came easy in the wet spring grass, straight-legged and bright-eyed, up and nursing within the hour. No losses. Wren sat on the tailgate of her truck and watched them find their footing in the low field, and wrote in her notebook, without ceremony, 11 calves. No losses. She'd done in 9 months. On ground the whole county said wouldn't feed a jackrabbit, with cattle the whole county called buzzard bait. What better funded operations in that same county had failed to do in years, taken almost nothing, and turned it into something more, without borrowing a dollar, or pushing the land past what it could bear. She didn't tell anyone. She wasn't built to announce things, and she'd already learned that the county's opinion of her wasn't going to move because she said so. She let the fact of the calves find its own way through the feed store and the gas station and the church parking lot, which it did, slowly, the way anything true moved through that country, until by June it was generally known that the Callaway girls' buzzard bait cows had thrown 11 live calves and lost none. It was received with the kind of grudging silence that, for that crowd, was the loudest compliment they knew how to pay. That summer, Wren began, in a small way, to sell. Not the cows, not yet the calves, but an idea that had been forming since she first understood what her grandfather had actually spent his life doing. Hollis hadn't been raising commodity cattle to compete by the pound against operations 10 times his size. He'd been building, one careful generation at a time, a small herd so precisely matched to that hard ground, so efficient at turning poor grass into good meat that the meat itself was different. And he'd sold it not by the truckload to a packer, but by the cut to the handful of people who understood the difference. And once, according to one entry, to a restaurant 2 counties over that bought everything he could supply, until the man who ran it retired and the arrangement lapsed. Wren read that entry a dozen times. Then she took the Duchess's first steer calf, once it was old enough, along with 2 others she'd raised entirely on grass, and had them processed at the small locker plant in the next town. She brought home the boxes, cooked 1 cut for her own supper, and understood, chewing, exactly what her grandfather had meant. It didn't taste like store beef. It tasted like the ground it came from. Deep, clean, particular. The taste of an animal that had eaten nothing its whole slow life but the diverse, deep-rooted forage of Rested Hill Pasture. She wrote 1 word in her notebook that night and underlined it the way Hollis had underlined the land keep score. Built different, she'd say later to the first customers who asked. And it stuck, unintentionally becoming the name the whole small enterprise went by, though she never once put it on a sign, because she never made a sign at all. The first sale was almost an accident, a mention to Silas at the counter that she'd put up more beef than she could eat. He bought a box on the spot, cash from the register, no discussion. A week later, he drove out himself, walked the fields with her in low September light, crouched at the edge of a rested pasture, and pushed his fingers into dark, root-laced soil that hadn't been grazed to dirt in over a year. He held the handful up and said that in 40 years of watching this county farm itself down to bedrock, he hadn't seen soil like that outside the river bottoms, and that Hollis used to hold out a handful, just like it, and say the exact same thing every time. The land keeps score. It just waits longer than we do. Wren felt something turn over in her chest she didn't have a name for. Word moved through the county, the way the buzzard bait story once had. Only inverted now. The thing everyone had mocked quietly, becoming the thing everyone was curious about. By October, she had a waiting list. She raised her prices. Nobody balked. The second winter, Dutch Marrow drove out to the farm, not to apologize, because men like Dutch don't apologize, but to appraise, to settle something that had started nagging at him from a distance. He sat in his truck a long while before he even rolled the window down, watching the herd feed sleek and content in a sheltered draw. They look good, he finally said. From Dutch, that was a confession of considerable size. He got out and walked the frozen field with her, ran a hand along the Duchess's broad back, and went quiet. Then he said he'd been running cattle in that county for 28 years, pouring more feed and more money into his herd, every single one of them, just to hold steady, watching his own ground get a little poorer every season. And here he was, standing on grass in February that beat his own ground in June. He asked to see the notebooks. She showed him. He never told a soul. At the feed store, he'd been wrong. And Grover kept asking about her buzzards out of pure momentum for another few months before he noticed Dutch wasn't laughing anymore. That spring, Dutch came back with a proposal. He'd fence off his worst 40 acres, the eroded corner that grew nothing but ragweed, rest, and rotate it exactly the way Hollis's notebooks described, buy 4 bred Edo heifers from Wren at full price to start it. And he wanted her out there every month telling him what he was doing wrong. She thought about it for a week, then said yes, because she had found another line by then, near the end of the last notebook. What you keep to yourself dies with you. What you teach outlives you. She decided she'd rather be the second kind. Word of Dutch's conversion did what her own quiet success alone never could have, because Dutch was, in his way, the county's loudest and largest voice. When he began selling grass-finished beef of his own, off that rested 40, the whole scale of what was possible shifted in people's minds. Other ranchers came out to the Kalik Road after that. Older men, mostly, who'd farmed ground into the dirt their whole lives and had a bad feeling in their bones about where it was headed. Wren walked them through her fields, let them push their own fingers into the sod, never charged for the walking. A man named Otto Kessler, who ran the poorest place in the county and the deepest debt, bought 2 heifers on quiet credit. Wren extended herself because he reminded her of how the notebooks described her grandfather in his own lean years. He paid it back in full within a year and named a heifer after her, which embarrassed them both. A serious, quiet teenager named Cole Ferris started coming out on Saturdays to help move cattle and mend fence. Wren paid him and taught him, and by the end of that summer, he could read a pasture nearly as well as she could, the same knowledge passing from a dead man through a stack of notebooks through her hands into a boy who'd carry it into a century Hollis never saw. The thing that turned a small, quiet success into something the whole region would eventually talk about was the drought. It came in the 4th year, the worst the county had seen. In living memory, worse than anything the oldest men could recall. It started in April, when the spring rains simply didn't come, deepened through a white-skied May, and by June had cracked the ground open and dried the creeks to stone. By July, the county was dying. The commodity herds that had been run hard on overgrazed land for decades had nothing to fall back on because the ground itself had no reserve, no deep roots, no organic matter left to hold what little moisture came. Grass that had been grazed to dirt every summer of its life simply gave up, browned, and blew away. Ranchers who'd mocked the buzzard bait girl 4 years earlier began, in July, and then in a flood through August, dumping cattle onto a collapsing market at whatever price they could get, hauling gaunt animals to the same stockyard pens where Wren had bought her 21, standing at the same rail watching a life's work sell for pennies. The whole county turned brown that summer. The whole county, except for the fields at the end of the Kalish Road, and Dutch Marrow's Rested 40, and Otto Kessler's fenced corner, and the scattered growing patches where somebody had listened and started farming the way Hollis Calloway once had, keeping the land covered, resting it, never punishing it, building the kind of deep-rooted, diverse sod that, in an ordinary year, simply grew better grass, and in a drought year held water like a sponge, and stayed green while everything around it died. Wren's pasture stayed green. People drove out just to look at it, the way you drive out to see a thing that shouldn't exist. 360 acres of hill ground standing in July grass, while the fat bottomland ranches downstream turned to dust. Her cattle, the sleek descendants of the 21 bony animals nobody had wanted, grazed through the worst drought in 100 years without losing condition, without a single bale of hay or bag of feed bought in, drinking from a spring in the deep draw that Hollis's notebooks noted had never once gone dry in his lifetime, because its recharge came from ground that still knew how to hold water. Wren moved them field to field on the same patient rotation she'd kept from day one. In the driest week of that terrible summer, she wrote the count of her herd in the notebook, and beneath it, one word, green. She underlined it. Dutch stood at her fence one white August evening, looked out at the impossible color of that grass, and said plainly that she'd been right and he'd been wrong, and her grandfather had been right 30 years before that, and the whole county had spent 3 generations laughing at the 2 people who'd understood the one thing that actually mattered. Wren didn't answer for a while. Then she said her grandfather had written that the land keeps score. She guessed it had been keeping score a lot longer than any of them had noticed. She didn't have to say she'd been right. The green field said it for her, all the way to the brown horizon. That autumn, when the rains finally came back, and the county began the slow work of counting its losses, demand for Wren's cattle, and her knowledge outran anything she could supply. This is the moment, the story goes, where a different kind of person makes a different kind of mistake, borrows against sudden fame, buys more ground and more cattle, scales up fast into the very kind of operation that had just failed. But Wren had read her grandfather's notebooks twice through by then, and she understood the deepest thing in them wasn't about grass or cattle at all. It was patience. Hollis had never once borrowed money to grow faster than the land could carry. He'd let demand pull the operation forward instead of pushing it with debt, adding ground only when the herd was ready for it, so that when the hard years came, and they always came, he owed nothing to anyone and could ride it out on the strength of the land itself. So Wren grew the way he had. She bought the next block of ground the year after the drought, from a neighbor whose commodity herd hadn't survived it, and rested it a full year before grazing it. She added cattle only as fast as her own herd bred them. A chef from the same city where her grandfather's old restaurant customer had once been drove out one afternoon, having heard about the green pasture and the beef people called built different, and an arrangement began that the notebooks would have recognized on sight. Ida Faubus lived long enough to see it. She was 93. The September the drought finally broke, when Wren drove her out to the farm, and they stood together at the fence in the low light, looking at the green fields and the sleek herd, and coal-moving cattle across the far pasture, the way he'd been taught. Ida didn't say much, because she never had, but she put her hand on the top rail, the same fence her sister had leaned on, and her brother-in-law had built, and looked out over the ground a long while. At last, she said that Hollis would have liked to see this, that he'd known it would come, even though he hadn't lived to see it, because he'd told her once, near the end, that he wasn't worried about the knowledge dying with him, since the land would keep it, and someday the right person would come back and read what the ground had to say. Wren said she guessed she'd been the one to come back. Ida looked at her, and something moved across that old, economical face that might have been a smile. "Those are the ones," she said. The same words she'd said 4 years earlier about the cattle. Wren understood she meant something larger now. Ida died the following spring, quietly, in her sleep. Wren buried her beside her sister and her brother-in-law on the hill above town, the two who'd understood and the two who'd been laughed at, though it turned out they'd been the same two people all along. She named a heifer after Ida. That spring, out of the Duchess's line. The Duchess herself grazed out her last easy years in the home field, unsold, the one animal Wren had promised herself would never leave. In the notebook, beside the date, Wren wrote the heifer's name without ceremony. Then, underneath it, she wrote a line of her own, the first that wasn't a weather note or a head count. The land keeps score. She underlined it once, the way the two who came before her had underlined the things that mattered, so that someday, whoever came back to read these pages the way she'd read her grandfather's would find it waiting for them, handed down, still true. The morning she wrote that line, by her own count, there were 160 head of cattle grazing the green fields of a farm. The whole county had once agreed wasn't worth the trouble. Descended, everyone, from 21 bony animals nobody wanted, on ground that had carried them through the worst drought in 100 years, while the fat farms turned to dust. Wren stood at the fence in the early light and looked at them for a long time, the way she had that first morning at the stockyard rail. This time. No one laughed. There was no one left in the county who didn't understand, finally, what she'd seen when she looked. The thing that had been true the whole way through. That the rejected thing is often the valuable thing if you know how to read it. That patience outlasts money, and attention outlasts force. And that worth doesn't need to argue for itself, because in the end, it simply proves itself.